My guest today is David Holt, and David is a data scientist at a company called FreightWaves based out of Chattanooga. We'll get into that a little bit more later. So David spent 13 years in the United States Army and eventually became an intelligence officer. And then he came to UT, started out studying business analytics, got a minor in economics, and then somewhere kind of the midstream, he kind of caught on to finance and started working in the Masters Investments Learning Center with Dr. Cole, and was a director of training there. And that's actually where I met David. David, I don't know if you remember this, and I don't actually know what was going on, but I do know that before I met you, something wasn't working with my computer, and then after I met you, it was, and so thanks for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but that's not the end of the story. So David, you weren't actually a finance major, but you sort of masqueraded as one throughout the College of Business, and everybody kind of thought you were. And then you entered the master's program in business analytics and graduated. And so then you went to FreightWaves after that. So thanks, David. Thanks for being here today. And just for a little bit of context, many of the people who are watching this are either finance majors that are getting significant exposure to the fields of either business analytics or supply chain or economics or accounting, or they are students who actually major in one of those fields and they're taking a fairly heavy dose of finance. And so, I thought, who better to come in and talk to this type of audience than you, because you really, I think, have successfully married those fields together, and you're living in that. So again, we're glad to have you today.
Happy to be here.
So just getting started, then David, could you tell us just a little bit about what FreightWaves is and what FreightWaves does?
Sure. So the whole thing started when a guy named Craig Fuller, who is a member of the family that owns US Express, realized that a lot of the way that people deal with the volatility in trucking, which is an incredibly huge industry that we don't talk a lot about here in America, a lot of the way that people deal with that volatility is just through hedging oil prices. That's what they can do. But oil price changes aren't really the majority of the volatility of prices. It's a weird giant market where you're dealing with the supply and demand for trucks to take a load someplace. But of course, you're not just talking about a truck and a load. You're talking about the place that truck came from and where it's going. And it's such a complex and interesting marketplace that he realized that there needed to be some way for people to hedge portions of that risk that had nothing to do with oil prices. And so he and some folks came up with the idea of freight futures for on the road freight. I think that CME has some maritime freight futures contracts, but they came up with this idea for how to manage portions of that risk. But then he realized if you want to get people to actually trade on those, there needs to be a source of information for them where they can understand what is driving those changes in prices so that they can make good decisions about how to get into that market. So his idea was sort of to become the Bloomberg of freight, of trucking. And so he wanted to create something that's called Sonar, which is a software as a service platform that gives people all kinds of information related to trucking, but we also do maritime, we also do air cargo stuff. And that's the portion of the company that I have a lot to do with, is the software that is Sonar. But then, in order to figure out how to talk about those things, they started bringing on market experts in all sorts of different areas. And he realized, I've got all these bright people. They are producing material that we send out to our customers in the same way that Bloomberg has reporters who are doing wonderful reporting all throughout the economy. And so those market experts started to produce media for us. And as that went along, we added on a podcast that became wildly popular within supply chain, ended up with a television studio in there. Craig, for a while, was spending a lot of time being a part of Bloomberg TV as a guest for things when they were talking about trucking. And so we ended up having an entire television studio as a part of the company. We've added on some additional properties in the media space like American Shipper and Modern Shipper. So just more supply chain and logistics reporting going on there. But we've also got a research arm called Passport, where they're going to talk about longer term trends. And a lot of what they're doing is driven by data that's sitting in Sonar. We bought a benchmarking company that talks about operating ratios for trucking called Engage. We've got something called BITA, the Blockchain in Trucking Alliance, that is talking about getting towards standards where the weirdness of a truck that just doesn't arrive. And of course, you're told, well, the reason no truck arrived, even though we felt like we had a contract, was because I didn't have the trucks available. It's very hard to prove that you didn't have a truck available. And so the BITA is talking about how you might be able to use blockchain to deal with that area of roughness in the market. And then when the pandemic hit, we were about to have a large conference. It's another thing that we just did because it was an enjoyable thing and we learned a lot from them, and our customers seemed to enjoy them. And we made the decision to use the knowledge we gained from the TV portion to start doing virtual events. We had some really brilliant folks involved in that who did a wonderful job, and that became a thing that people started asking for. And so Firecrown was created within the FreightWaves umbrella to deal with putting together events for folks, whether they were our own events or private events. So we've sort of grown out from trucking futures, but it is all a very organic sort of growth that we've seen. Things feed each other really well. The benchmarking thing allows us, though obviously we're not going to turn around and publish any of our customers' data, it allows us to look in and say, hey, are the things that we are saying are likely to happen actually then happening, which is extremely helpful for us, allows us to help benchmark for them even better. So it keeps growing, but it keeps growing in ways that have very interesting second and third order effects that help my little corner.
Yeah. Well, let's. I want to hit it at one particular kind of, and I think this is sort of a central thing with what you all do at FreightWaves. But when we start talking about finance in my intro class, very early, we get into the topic of markets and taking kind of a 30,000 foot view of markets. We just kind of start with the idea that there's a buyer, there's a seller, there's some venue in which they meet, they negotiate prices and quantities, and we have transactions. And well, that's a very general description. In my intro to finance class, we very quickly pivot into financial markets, such as the U.S. equities markets, where we sort of know what buyers and sellers are, and this thing they're trading, it's shares of stock. And the nice thing about the equities markets as we know them is that process is very transparent. And as long as you're trading a reasonable number of shares, you can pretty easily find someone to trade with. You can get to a price very quickly. And there's really almost no risk at all of the other party not delivering. And so that's what sort of my students know and think about in markets. But you're talking about freight. At its very core, you're speaking of a market as well, right? You've got buyers.
Absolutely.
You've got sellers. But compared to the U.S. equity markets that we talk about a lot, you guys are living in the wild, wild west. I think in terms of like transparency and kind of the way the process works. But you guys at FreightWaves, y'all are right in the middle of it, and so it's there's things I think that cause problems for many people participating in those markets, and you guys I think are providing solutions. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, about jumping into that space and the market you deal with.
Love to. So the market, it is fascinating, honestly, because there's the time component, of course, where, you know, any given company has a load that they want and they want it taken on a certain day and delivered on a certain day, and that's great. And there's you also have the spatial component. We often talk about 3-digit zip codes. So the first 3 digits of a zip code, and there are 884 of those that are physical ones for the United States. But of course, that means that there are 780,000 or so lanes going from one zip 3 to another one that you are looking at. And of course, a part of what's tricky about the market is you need a truck to be not just in the one where they would pick up, but willing to go to the one where they would drop off. And so the complexity for drivers is incredible. But you also have the fact that though there are electronic load boards, which is a place online where you can go and say, I have this load that needs to go from here to there on such and such a date, and people who are shippers can go or people who are carriers can go and pick those up and move them. But you also have a huge amount of the market that is done just on a cell phone call, somebody calling up a guy that they know who might have a line on a load that they could take from the place that they happen to be going. So with that, and with how many small shippers you've got and how many brokers exist, you know, third-party logistics folks who are at times doing wonderful jobs figuring out routes for trucks to go, but at other times just sort of capitalizing on the lack of transparency that's in the market. It's just a very complicated thing trying to make sure that the right trucks, the right number of trucks, and at times the right types of trucks, because you've got various types of trucks, are going to be in the right place at the right time to take somebody's load from one place to another. So it is incredibly complicated.
And so a lot of what you guys do is actually shining light on that transparent, that opaque market and increasing some transparency and sort of putting buyers and sellers together in an efficient manner.
Where the first step is just sort of looking at the overall trends, how a market works in a given town on average, and then also looking at how it's working right now. So we've got data vendors that we work with who give us some amount of light into how things seem to be going for them in different markets. And we're trying to aggregate these things in a way that we never lose for our customers any of their competitive advantage, but make sure that we can be telling the market in general, hey, there seems to be a lot more freight right now coming out of Phoenix than there usually is. Trucks that would usually just go and sit in Los Angeles waiting for ships to come into port might want to run down to Phoenix and pick up a load, so that there is, you know, less freight waiting, but also so that there is less deadheading, people driving from place to place with nothing on the back of them. So
yeah, I mean, if you drive an empty truck, you drive an empty truck from one place to the next, you only lose money.
Absolutely. And
so
no one likes it.
Yeah, so your title is senior data scientist.
Yes.
What does that mean? What what's the 2-minute version of what you personally do?
So I personally am looking at creating proxies for the information that you would really want. It's not possible to have all of the information about where every load is going to be and where every truck is going to be. That's just untenable. But it's also impossible to really know the true supply and demand side in that macro sense. And so what we're trying to do, and what I do, is look for ways that I can talk about whether or not the carriers or shippers have more power to set pricing in a particular town, or whether volume is increasing or decreasing based upon the average in a given market, whether or not more requests for freight are being rejected, which is going to drive the price up. So a lot of that, and then looking into how we could forecast those, especially into the near-term future, in a way that will give people an idea of what's coming in the next few days, so that they can plot not just their next stop, but maybe the next 2 stops for each of their trucks. So those systems of forecasting and creating proxies are what I do.
And so I think at the it sounds to me from talking to you that at the core of your professional identity, there's basically a programmer. I mean, you seem to be kind of a programmer at heart. I know that our students have ample opportunities to learn different languages, but there's a learning curve. And so, you know, someone's 20 years old, 21 years old, starting to learn a language, they have to make choices as to what they start dabbling in and learning in. So in your programming life, what languages do you live in? Where do you spend your time?
Me personally, I spend my time mostly in R and in SQL, a little bit in Python, but that's mostly to glue everything together and move some stuff around. But the team that I'm on, we've got some folks who are much heavier in Python. We've also got a bunch of folks who are in all sorts of specialty languages for doing one specific thing at a given time. The thing that I enjoy the most about it is we also have a guy who does a lot in Power BI and Tableau. And there are so many different backgrounds with respect to coding just on my team. Our chief data scientist, he did computer science as an undergrad, but then he got an MBA and then his CFA. He comes from the world of finance. And so he's done Python programming for that. But then our director of data science is a PhD in hydrology. And so it comes from that area. I think we've got an MS in biostatistics, quantitative econ MBA, and then me with an MSBA. So though we all code, we all came at it from somewhat different directions and use different tools. I use R because it's the fastest way for me to think in code. But there's nothing wrong realistically with using Excel, which is a way in which one can write code. It just will not always get called code by computer science people.